What if someone you loved disappeared into the night, never to return? No warning, no goodbyes, just gone. That's exactly what happened to Janine Brown, a 23-year-old woman from Whitehouse, Ohio. One moment she was out enjoying herself at a bar. The next, she vanished without a trace. For decades, her case remained unsolved, a haunting mystery. Leads went cold, suspects came and went. But there was one clue, one tiny, overlooked detail that could have solved everything from the start. A tan van. Who was behind the wheel? And why did it take 30 years to bring a killer to justice? Tonight, we're diving deep into the case of Janine Brown, a woman who walked into the darkness and never walked out. November 17th, 1983. Janine Brown wasn't planning for anything unusual that night. She wasn't traveling, wasn't going anywhere new. She was doing something she had done many times before going to the Copper Lantern, a small town bar where locals gathered for drinks, music, and conversation. She knew the place, she knew the people, she was comfortable there. But by the end of the night, something shifted. Janine got into a heated argument with her boyfriend, Harold Estep. What were they fighting about? No one knows for sure. Some say it was jealousy. Others claim it was about another man. But one thing was certain, it wasn't small talk. Witnesses saw Harold storm out of the bar, leaving Janine alone. At that moment, her fate was sealed. Janine didn't leave immediately. She stayed for several more hours, drinking, talking, trying to shake off the tension. But as the night dragged on, the crowd thinned out. People went home. And then, at 4 a.m., Janine made a choice. She stepped outside into the cold, empty street. And someone was waiting for her. Chester. That was his name. A resident at a nearby nursing home, he wasn't out partying that night. He wasn't part of the bar scene, but he was watching. In the dead of night, from the window of his room, Chester saw something. A tan van pulled up outside the Copper Lantern. The engine hummed, the headlights flickered, and then Janine appeared. She stood outside, hesitant. She wasn't running, she wasn't forced inside, but she also wasn't confident. Chester watched as Janine paused, as if weighing her options. And then, after what felt like forever, she got in. The van pulled away. And that was the last time anyone saw Janine Brown alive. At first, no one panicked. Janine was independent. She didn't always check in with her family right away. Maybe she was blowing off steam after the argument. Maybe she crashed at a friend's house. But then she didn't show up for work. No calls, no messages, nothing. Days passed. Her friends started asking around. Have you seen Janine? Everyone said the same thing, no. Her parents grew desperate. They called hospitals, checked with the police. Maybe she got arrested. Maybe she was in an accident, but there were no reports. Janine Brown had vanished. That's when the fear turned into reality. Her family filed a missing persons report, but this was Whitehouse, Ohio, a small town. People didn't just disappear, unless someone made them disappear. And then exactly 1 week later, a hunter made a chilling discovery. It was early morning. The woods were quiet, covered in a thin layer of frost. The hunter was moving carefully, rifle in hand, searching for deer. Then he saw something. At first, he thought it was a pile of old clothes, half buried under the fallen leaves. But when he stepped closer, he froze. It wasn't clothes, it was a body. Janine Brown. Her clothes were torn, her body bruised and battered. It was clear this was no accident. She had fought back. Whoever killed her had been violent, brutal. But there were no fingerprints, no weapon, no clear evidence pointing to a suspect. Just one thing was certain. This was murder. And now the hunt for the killer began. When someone is murdered, who do police look at first? The boyfriend, Harold Estep, the man Janine fought with that night, the last person who saw her before she left the bar. Did their argument get out of hand? Did he snap? Police brought him in for questioning. They pushed him. Where were you that night? Who were you with? What happened after you left the bar? Harold denied everything. He said he went straight home after their fight. At first, police didn't buy it. Men lie, especially guilty ones. But then they checked his alibi, and it held up. Harold had been nowhere near the crime scene. He had witnesses, proof. That meant one thing. Harold didn't kill Janine. So if it wasn't him, who did? Every small town has its eccentric characters, the ones people whisper about, the ones who seem just a little too different. In Whitehouse, Ohio, that man was Bill Crazy Horse Heisinger, a survivalist, a loner, a man obsessed with knives. He lived on the outskirts of town, spending most of his time alone, talking about hunting, weapons, and survival tactics. People said he could live off the grid if he wanted to. And after Janine's murder, rumors started swirling. Some claimed he had talked about the case in disturbing detail. Others swore they heard him bragging about it almost as if he knew something no one else did. Was he just talking, or had he actually killed Janine? Police brought him in for questioning. Heisinger didn't flinch. He answered their questions, but something about him felt off. Investigators had to know for sure. They tested his DNA against the evidence from Janine's body. The results came back. No match. Another dead end. Then came Larry Reeder. Not just a random suspect, Janine's ex-boyfriend. People said he never got over her, that he still talked about her, thought about her, maybe even still loved her. Was he the kind of man who could kill out of jealousy? Police wanted to bring him in for questioning, but there was one problem. Larry was dead. A few years after Janine's murder, Larry had been in a fatal car accident. But even in death, the police weren't about to let him off the hook. They tested his DNA against the crime scene evidence, and once again, no match. 3 men, 3 suspects, 3 dead ends. Janine's case was going ice cold until someone took a second look at a clue that had been there all along. The tan van. For 30 years, it had been a footnote in the case, a detail buried in witness statements. But now, it was the one clue that could solve everything. Investigators went back through old reports. Who owned a tan van in Whitehouse, Ohio in 1983? One name stood out: Andy Gustafson, a wealthy local man, a familiar face in town, and someone who had told police over and over again that he had never met Janine Brown. But was he telling the truth? Or had he been lying all along? Andy Gustafson wasn't just another name on a list. He was a man with power, money, and influence in Whitehouse, Ohio. He had heard the whispers, seen the way investigators had been circling him. But every time they asked about Janine Brown, his answer was the same: I never met her. And when they asked where he was on the night of November 17th, 1983, he had an alibi ready to go. He claimed he was nowhere near the Copper Lantern that night. But when detectives dug deeper, things didn't quite add up. His timeline was vague. His details were inconsistent. And the one person who could supposedly confirm his whereabouts, they were dead. Investigators were suspicious, but without hard evidence, they couldn't touch him. And so Janine Brown's case and her killer went cold. For 30 years. Fast forward to 2013. 3 decades had passed. For most, Janine Brown was just another unsolved case, another tragedy that had faded into memory. But then something changed. DNA technology had evolved. In 1983, forensic testing was primitive. Investigators had collected evidence from Janine's body, but it was useless at the time. Now, that same evidence could finally reveal the truth. Detectives took the old DNA samples and ran them through modern forensic databases. And when the results came back, one name appeared: Andy Gustafson. But police needed more. They had Andy's DNA on Janine's body, but he could still try to explain it away, say they had some kind of secret relationship, that it didn't mean he had killed her. They needed a smoking gun, and they found it. Inside an old tan Chevy van, tucked away among forgotten evidence, there was a Merit cigarette butt. A small, overlooked detail, something no one had thought much about. But when forensic experts tested it, it contained two sets of DNA. One belonged to Andy Gustafson, the other, Janine Brown. How was that possible if, as Andy had said for decades, he had never met her? The walls were closing in. For 30 years, Andy Gustafson had been adamant he had never met Janine Brown. But now, with DNA evidence placing her in his van, his story suddenly changed. Okay, maybe she was in my van, but I didn't kill her. It was a complete contradiction to everything he had claimed before. Investigators pressed him. Why was her DNA in your vehicle? Why did you lie? What really happened that night? Andy had no good answers. He stuttered. He hesitated. He danced around the truth. But one thing was clear: he was running out of lies. Was he still hiding something? Or was this just the first crack in his carefully built facade? Either way, his time was up. On a cold morning in 2013, police arrived at Andy Gustafson's house. This time they weren't asking questions. They were there to arrest him. The charges? Felony manslaughter. First-degree rape. The man who had spent decades evading justice was finally in handcuffs. For Janine Brown's family, it was a moment of relief, but also pain. Because even though Andy was behind bars, the battle wasn't over. Not yet. For 30 years, Janine Brown's family had waited for this moment, the day her killer would finally face justice. But when Andy Gustafson stood in court in 2014, he didn't fight the charges. He didn't try to prove his innocence. Instead, he pleaded guilty. At first, it seemed like a victory, until the judge announced his sentence: 15 years, 10 years for manslaughter, 5 years for first-degree assault. That was it. 15 years for a brutal, violent murder that had haunted a family for decades. Was this really justice, or was it just another failure of the system? The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Janine's family sat in the front row, shaking their heads in disbelief. Her mother had spent 3 decades fighting for answers, only to see her daughter's killer receive a sentence that felt like a slap on the wrist. 15 years. That meant Andy would walk free by the time he was an old man. No life sentence, no death penalty, just a countdown until he could return to his life. Was this all Janine's life was worth? Her friends and family demanded answers, but the justice system had already made its decision. And soon Andy Gustafson would be back on the streets. Janine Brown was just 23 years old when her life was stolen from her. She wasn't just a name in a case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams and ambitions. She had plans, a future, a life she was meant to live. People who knew her described her as vibrant, full of energy, someone who loved to laugh, loved to dance, loved being surrounded by friends. She was the kind of person who lit up a room. She was planning for a new chapter in her life, maybe settling down, maybe moving somewhere new, maybe chasing a dream that had yet to unfold. But instead, her future was ripped away in a moment of violence. Her last night was spent at a bar she had been to many times before, surrounded by people she thought she knew. She didn't know that someone, a predator, a monster, was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Andy Gustafson took everything from her. And yet, the justice system decided that his life would go on. 15 years. That's all he got for a crime that left a family shattered. That meant he would breathe free air again. He would see his family again, while Janine's family would never see her again. How is that fair? How does that feel like justice? And yet, that's exactly what happened. But even as Andy was locked away, there were still unanswered questions, because some people weren't convinced that he had acted alone. Even with Andy Gustafson behind bars, there was a lingering unease. Something didn't feel right about his version of events. Did he really act alone? Or was someone else in that tan van that night? For 30 years, Andy had denied ever knowing Janine Brown. Then, once DNA exposed his lies, he changed his story suddenly. She had been in his van, but he still insisted, "I didn't kill her." It was a drastic shift, and it raised a chilling possibility. Was he covering for someone? Could someone else have been involved? There were also questions about the crime itself. Andy's guilty plea meant there was no trial, no cross-examination, no opportunity to dissect the full truth of what happened that night. But here's the thing: Andy wasn't charged with murder. He was charged with manslaughter and first-degree assault. Manslaughter implies an element of accident or recklessness. But was Janine's death really an accident? Or was this something far darker, a crime that was planned, deliberate, and far more brutal than anyone ever knew? And what about the tan van? For years, police had been searching for a vehicle just like Andy's. Was it possible that Andy wasn't the only man in town driving one? Could another suspect have been missed? Or was the truth even worse? Could Andy have had an accomplice? These are the questions that still haunt Janine's case. Because even with a conviction, even with Andy in prison, the full truth may never be known. The town of Whitehouse, Ohio, hasn't forgotten Janine Brown. Even decades later, people still remember her face, her name, and the fear that gripped the town when she vanished. For a long time, Whitehouse was a quiet place, the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other, where things like murder felt like something that only happened somewhere else. But after Janine's disappearance, something shifted. People became cautious. Trust was shaken. For 30 years, the case lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. Was the killer still out there? Could it happen again? For some, the truth brought relief. Andy Gustafson was finally named, arrested, and convicted. But for others, it didn't feel like justice. 15 years behind bars for stealing an entire life. It felt like a slap in the face. And here's the most chilling question of all. What if DNA had never caught up with him? What if forensic technology hadn't advanced? Would Andy Gustafson have gotten away with it forever? How many other killers walk free today simply because the evidence hasn't spoken yet? It makes you wonder how many other cases out there are just waiting to be solved, and more importantly, how many other murderers think they got away with it. Now, I leave you with this. Did Andy Gustafson get off too easy? Or is there more to this case than we know? Was he really alone that night, or did police stop digging too soon? And here's the biggest question. Do you think the justice system failed Janine Brown? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Because cases like this aren't just stories, they're real lives, real victims, real questions that still need answers. And if you love true crime, unsolved mysteries, and deep investigations, make sure to subscribe because we have more chilling cases to uncover. Thanks for watching. Stay safe. And remember, justice delayed is not always justice denied.